Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody.
We're not in a day where we need a moment. We're in a day where we have to build a movement that intersects and brings us all together. We don't know yet what would happen if we had in 30 to 40 states a moral poor people's campaign with people in state capitals over an extended period of time. But I think we ought to find out.
Because everybody's got a right to live.
So I want to have our first presenters make their way to the front. And the discussion is why a poor people's campaign. And I should say, as people come up who are going to do the presentation, Larry Cox from the Kairos Center that's located in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. And Erica Williams, Reverend Erica Williams, who's been working on this, who's also on the repair staff. If y'all will make your way to the front, and whoever else on that, whoever, and please just come to the front while I talk about what y'all are doing. I just wanted to say that this movement to have a new Poor People's Campaign, new in many ways, is important and something that Repairers is taking on for the next year as we get ready for the 50th anniversary of the National Poor People's Campaign. So Larry and Shailly and Erica.
Thank you, Roz. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, fantastic. We are here. So my name is Shailly Gupta Barnes, and as Roz said, I'm here with the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice in New York City. And we've taken up as an organization, along with several other organizations in this country, the commitment to reviving Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's vision of a Poor People's Campaign and a new Poor People's Campaign for today. So this morning I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that vision. And we've included in your folder a handout with several of King's own words, several quotes of his, speaking to what this campaign was in his time and why he believed it was necessary. So we'll tell you a little bit about this vision and then why we've seen why its relevance and its meaningfulness today, and why we think it's in fact necessary to ending poverty and the social ills that are associated with it. And Larry will speak after me for some time about what's changed since 1968 and where we are in this moment, nearly 50 years later. And then Ms. Erica will speak to what's been happening and what the New Poor People's Campaign has been taking on in the past several months and recent years. But before I get to that, I think it's important to say a little bit about why the Kairos Center has taken this up and where we come from. So our history comes out of a longer history of poor people's organizing and poor people's movements in the United States. From the 1960s and 70s, we have many leaders and networks coming out of the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggles, and also the struggles over welfare rights. And through, those developed into different kinds of struggles in the 1980s and the 1990s. Struggles, continued around welfare rights and welfare reform, but also the homeless organizing and the takeovers of empty homes to provide shelter to homeless families. And with the National Union of the Homeless is a key moment in our organizational history that we trace back to, where at one point it had over 25 chapters across the country and over 20,000 members. So that was a significant moment when poor people were taking the means that were available or at hand, meaning empty homes, and turning those into statements, political statements about what the great need that could be filled and that wasn't being filled by the capacity that existed, by the stock of housing that existed at the time. And then in the past decade, in the past 10 to 15 years, we've come into relationship with, again, these networks have kind of evolved into struggles around low wage jobs and unemployment and underemployment, around healthcare, around foreclosures and the debt crises, including student debt crisis, and the problems of housing and homelessness, which really have just grown and persisted through the 1980s and 90s to today. Water crises, war and peace, and really many, many more. So while our organization as an organization is rather small and scrappy, we're very much connected to communities and grassroots and religious leaders all across the country who are fighting for really basic needs and fundamental human rights. And it's through our connection with these communities and bringing them into relationship with each other that we've been able to kind of develop an ongoing assessment of the historic moment that we're in. The historic moment we're in economically, the historic moment we're in politically, and we've concluded that the way to end these conditions that have really kind of persisted and gotten worse in many ways along the years is a return. The only way to kind of end these conditions and realize our rights to housing and to clean water and to education and health care and good decent jobs with dignified wages, and to protect our civil rights, our rights to vote, our rights to organize and assemble in peace against what is morally wrong. To protect all of these, we've come to the conclusion that we need a return, a revival, you could say, of Dr. King's vision of a Poor People's Campaign. But again, for today's conditions and growing out of today's struggles for human rights. So what was that vision? King expressed his vision of the Poor People's Campaign as a transition from an era of civil rights to an era of human rights, a move from an era of reform to an era of revolution. And what he was talking about was a revolution of values, and being able to see and understand that what was going on at the time, was morally wrong, and then to aspire and to organize for something fundamentally and wholly different. He was building these connections between the Vietnam War and to the war on poverty, how resources that were going to the war meant that resources weren't available here. So people were being pit against each other in a cruelly unjust way. And he saw that our whole society, our economic, our political and social structure was built up around these social wrongs of racism, of poverty, and of militarism. And if our whole structure was built up on these wrongs, the way to end those wrongs was to change that structure. And the way he suggested doing this, what he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign around at the time of his death, was to bring those most impacted by those wrongs together on a common basis, to articulate a new moral voice against those wrongs and lead the way for all of us out of those conditions towards a path of freedom. So let me share with you his voice now.
The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the life of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. The only real revolutionary, people say, is a man who has nothing to lose. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. They can be helped to take action together. They will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life.
So this was his vision, and it was defined by the coming together, the unity, building the unity of the various people, the millions of people at that time who were being affected by these moral wrongs, and through that unity, awakening the mass consciousness of the American and global people to the necessity and the possibility of ending those wrongs. This was the heart of the moral revolution of values that he sought to realize in 1968 through the Poor People's Campaign. And you can see here the kind of organizing he was doing at that time, what he was doing to be bringing these people together.
We assemble here together today with common problems, bringing together ethnic groups that maybe have not been together in this type of meeting in the past. I know I haven't been in a meeting like this, and it's been one of my dreams that we would come together and realize our common problems. Power for poor people will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structure of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no.
So here we are in Washington, D.C., nearly 50 years later. And again, we're here to both learn from King and then come together around what is necessary and possible today. Because this is what the Poor People's Campaign has to be about if we're building one today as well. And so what we've been doing for the past several years is bringing together these leaders who are engaging in the struggles breaking out in these times. And we've been to, with a network of different organizations, to over 30 states, to the Gulf Coast, the Deep South, the West Coast, really everywhere, Appalachia, and seeing that nearly half of this country is living in conditions of poverty. And when I say poverty, I mean it in a very broad sense. I mean people living in conditions that degrade the value, that degrade the sanctity of life, conditions that don't need to exist today, like not having a place to live or having that place be poisoned or unsafe or insecure in the wealthiest country in the world. So we'll hear more about these conditions and how people are confronting them with unbridled courage and deep faith in the next few hours. And whether we believe in a higher power or not, if we share the belief that life is precious, that we must see these conditions as an affront to that core human belief. And if we do believe in a God, then we must see these conditions as violating the fundamental core of all religions. That is, that life is sacred, life is divine, and therefore whatever is causing these conditions is fundamentally against God. So we must be compelled to end these conditions, to, let's say, in this time in the wealthiest, most productive era in human history, let's say that we have a right to not be poor. And let that be the moral revolution that we seek today. So let's think about this vision with King's vision in mind and what's breaking out today of a new Poor People's Campaign and why we're here together this morning.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just very brief. My name is Larry Cox. I'm a co-director of the Kairos Center with Liz Taylor-Harris and colleague to Shailly. And I want to just build very briefly on what Shailly just started talking about. But before I do that, I just have to say, it is so uplifting to see you all here today on New Year's Eve at a moment when God knows we need to be lifted up so we can prepare for the long struggle ahead. So I just want to thank you all for coming here. It's very appropriate that we have lifted up the words and the vision of Dr. King. But as our purpose, as Dr. Barber said this morning at the press conference, our purpose is not to commemorate what happened, the movement that Dr. King led 50 years ago. Our purpose is to learn from that experience, to learn from that movement so that we can today build the kind of movement we need to face what is in some ways an even greater challenge. That's what we're trying to do. So the first thing I think we have to remember about what happened in 1968 is that as great as Dr. King was, the Poor People's Campaign did not come out of just one mind and one heart. The Poor People's Campaign, the idea of the Poor People's Campaign, emerged from what was a decade of collective mass movements and struggles in this country. It was an incredible, and I'm happy to see there are people in this room who not only study but also remember that decade. It was an incredible moment where you had people being killed imprisoned and killed in the South. You had the rebellions in the North against intolerable misery and poverty. And you had people who were fighting against the diversion of massive resources that could have been used to address those problems, but were instead being used to bomb and kill people in Vietnam. And it was the struggle against these terrible and in many ways traumatic events that led Dr. King and others to realize that simply ending racial apartheid in the South would not be enough. As hard as it was, as heroic as it was to try to do it, it would not be enough to touch the kind of massive misery and suffering that the system had produced all over the United States, both North and South. That something else was needed to do that. As he said, what was needed was that we had to move. And we just heard this from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. And that we had to recognize that we cannot solve our problems, he said, now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. You know, we often hear the words of Dr. King, especially on ceremonies like we're just about to have, but we don't often really listen to those words. So I just want to repeat that. He said, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. And you really can't get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. That's the conclusion he came to out of a decade of deep sacrifice and struggle all over the country. How do you change? How do you even think about changing the whole structure of American society? Clearly, it can't be done by just doing business as usual. Clearly, it can't be done simply by doing what had always been done. For him, it needed to find what he called a new and unsettling force. And for him, that force had to be a force that would be led by the poor and dispossessed. And this, it's important to emphasize, was not because he had some kind of romantic notion or condescending notion about the poor. It was because he understood two things about people who have been rendered poor in this society and kept poor in this society. One is that their very lives embody all the injustices that we are fighting against. There isn't an injustice that doesn't impact most dramatically against poor people. They are living all of the issues and all of the injustices that we are fighting against. And two, so that gives them a kind of, moral authority and moral power that others don't have. And secondly, he realized, as was said, that they had the least to lose and the most to gain from the restructuring of America. And that gave them a kind of strong revolutionary commitment that was needed. When he said we needed a poor people's movement, he didn't mean a movement that would be made up only of poor people. He knew you can't change America unless you get everybody, including everyone in this room, involved in it. And it wasn't a movement that was to be only for the poor people, because everybody, in some way, even the wealthiest among us, suffer from an unjust society, living in an unjust society. But he knew that it had to be a movement that would be led by the poor and the dispossessed. That was the call that he made. Now, we're going to hear a lot in the next month about how, as people have already pointed out, how Dr. King had a dream. They always say he had a dream. And it's true, he did have a dream, but he was not a dreamer. He was not a dreamer. He had a very clear notion of what he was up against, that he was up against a society and a movement that was coming apart just at this moment, that he was up against a state that was willing, and particularly in agencies like the FBI, that was willing to do anything it wanted to do to destroy a movement and its leaders that threatened the status quo. He knew what he was up against, especially he saw very clearly how racism and sexism have been used to divide the poor, how it had been used to convince, for example, poor white people that instead of fighting, their enemy was not the people who were oppressing them, but their enemy was really even the people who were more oppressed than they are, people of color. That's what racism had done, and he knew that that divide was very real and would not be easily overcome. And he also knew one other thing, and this is on which I'll end, which was that if we didn't try this, and if we didn't succeed, the suffering would get worse. It would not only continue, but in many ways would get worse. That this was something that had to be tried. And of course now, as we gather here today, we know he was right. Because as we look what's happening today, and as the audit that Dr. Forbes has called for will confirm and document, in many ways the situation has gotten even worse. But as we gather here, there's also one other thing, which is that we have opportunities that Dr. King did not have in 1968. We have opportunities to transform this society, to face the crisis and overcome the crisis in ways that he did. And I'll just mention quickly two, very quickly. One is that in 1968, you still had a situation where there was a middle class that continued to gain based on the kind of economic boom that happened after World War II, that felt it could gain and move up, and it was moving up. And so the divide that many people saw was a divide between what they called the middle class and what they called the underclass. That was the divide. Today, the divide that people talk about is not that divide, because we know it no longer exists. It's a divide between the 99% and the 1%. That's the divide that people are already understanding and talking about. Because in the last decades, we have seen the middle class, people who thought they were moving up, moving down. And so that you have a situation in America today, as we'll see, as people document after we're done, where 47%, nearly half the country, is either poor or actually living in poverty. That's an incredible situation. So that's one thing that's changed. It means that objectively, there's a basis for unity. Doesn't mean it will come easily, but at least there's an objective basis for it that didn't exist in 1968. And the second thing is that unlike 1968, where movements that had been in existence for a while were beginning to come apart and divide and fight among themselves, the movement we've been seeing developing in this country is just beginning. It's just beginning to come together. We're just beginning to create the kind of movement we need. And the struggles that are happening right now, Black Lives Matter, the Fight for 15, the environmental movement to bring about climate change, those movements are still in many ways in their infancy, and there is still the possibility to bring them together. And for that, to discuss that situation, I want to turn over to my wonderful colleague, Erica.
Good morning, everyone. We're brief because we only have a few more minutes so we can ask questions, but I really, this is near and dear to my heart. And so one of the things I want to talk about, Dr. King had a quote that says, "I choose to identify with the underprivileged. I choose to identify with the poor. I choose to give my life for the hungry. I choose to give my life for those who have been left out. This is the way that I'm going. If it means I suffer a little bit, I'm going all the way. If it means dying for them, I'm going that way." Those are the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that's whose shoulders that I stand upon today as a woman and as a clergy person. And so this Poor People's Campaign that we talk about today, I'm gonna bring you the reality of what we're seeing across this country. We've been to Selma, Alabama, where we went to the 50th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery, and we were able to be there to see the environmental injustice that's taking place in Alabama. We've also traveled to North Carolina to be with the HK on which is the historic Jones March, to see thousands of people coming together saying, we're not standing down. We're gonna stand together because every issue that we're facing in our country, a lot of these issues we know are immoral. It don't take rocket science to know it, right? And so not only have we been to North Carolina, we've also been to the Midwest. We've been to Flint, Michigan. How many of you know about the water issue that's still going on to this day? That even though they have stopped talking about it in the media, children are still not able to have fresh water. People are still struggling to have their basic needs met. So that's an issue. And we've also traveled out of this country. We've been to Brazil. So we're not just domestic, we're international. And across the country, we see that poverty, those on the margins of society, are left out often, all the time, not often, all the time. And so as a person of clergy, that is why it is so important that we have this new Poor People's Campaign. Because at the end of the day, I don't know about you, but I can't rest. As the great Fannie Lou Hamer said, none of us are free until we all are free. And so today I stand here, I gotta be done in 1 minute, but I want you to understand with this new Poor People's Campaign, that this is serious. And not only is it serious, it is a mandate, I believe, from God. I believe that God is calling us in this hour to stand up. As Dr. King did in 1968, he didn't get a chance to see the Poor People's Campaign to come to fruition, but we can. And we will do it. And I count on all of you to make sure that you engage the people from the Kairos Center, because I promise you, this is the work that we need to do together. Together. And so I close out with saying, as Dr. King said, everybody deserves to have 3 meals a day. Everybody deserves to be able to have culture for their spirits and for their minds. And everybody deserves to have the basic human rights. And so the Poor People's Campaign is not just that we need to do it, we must do it. And we're counting on each of you to join us in that fight.
Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down in jail, because everybody's got a right to live.